Hi, my name is Andrea, and together with Maria, Farah, Sara, and Tim, I will be presenting the topic of corruption in times of COVID-19. More specifically, we will be answering the question of how the pandemic has affected global corruption. The first part of our presentation will be dedicated to the interlink of the COVID-19 pandemic and global corruption. We will then move on to the German mask scandal case study, and lastly, we will analyze the subsequent consequences of the scandal. Since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the topic of corruption, especially in the healthcare sector, has increasingly shifted in the focus of regulators, experts, political institutions, and the general public. This chapter shall therefore answer the question as to how the ongoing pandemic has influenced and continues to influence global corruption. The outbreak of the novel coronavirus, which has been declared by the World Health Organization on March 11, 2020, has had an impact on countries of all levels of economic development. Due to the nature of crises, which are characterized by turmoil and disorganization, an amplification of corruption is observable, as they lay the foundation for individuals to utilize the widespread state of emergency for their own benefit. This directly applies to the ongoing pandemic, during which violations of law set out to fight corruption have been increasing on a global scale. These violations come in the form of evading the fine government procurement process or taking bribes to facilitate preferential treatment. The relevance of corruption in present times is even reinforced on the grounds that the World Health Organization has tracked the origin of the virus back to a market in the Chinese city of Wuhan that is known for the corrupt trade of exotic animals, implying the potential of COVID-19 being the result of corruption itself. The increased risk of corruption has furthermore been recognized by multiple globally operating organizations, such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Economic Forum, or the World Bank, early on in the pandemic, as there has been a public call for increased alertness and an expansion of anti-corruption measures. The reasons for an increase in corrupt behavior during the ongoing pandemic are of different characters. First, due to the chaotic nature of a crisis, governments are urged to implement new regulations swiftly, and decisions have to be taken quickly due to the often unpredictable development of a pandemic. This quick decision-making has the potential to decrease attention given to corrupt behaviors within governmental structures, of suppliers and healthcare workers, as focus is shifted to ensuring medical care of the general public and suitable crisis mitigation. Furthermore, during the pandemic, an unprecedented amount of public funds are still provided. For example, more than 82 trillion USD were provided by the International Monetary Fund to 77 countries or in form of a governmental assistance program, such as in Germany. This provides fertile ground for various forms of corruption, especially rent-seeking, as only an inferior level of oversight and transparency over the use of deployed public funds was and is available, due to the regulatory changes needed to be made in short periods of time. Lastly, touching upon the created intransparency once more, one of the greatest corruption risks is posed by the public procurement process, which will be examined later in this presentation. Here, suppliers and public officials can take advantage of the somewhat intransparent governmental procurement process for ensuring the availability of medical equipment to the respective general public, included but not limited to big rigging, embezzlement of financial funds made available for the healthcare sector, nepotism and favoritism within board of management, petty corruption of doctors and medical workers, fraud, misuse of power. When it comes to corruption of frontline healthcare workers, factors driving these corruptions are low wages, sharply increased pressure due to the high amount of incoming patients, and a general staff shortage, which points out the structural deficiency of nation-specific healthcare systems. These factors increase the incentive for corruptive behavior, which includes but is not limited to frontline healthcare workers offering preferential treatment after receiving bribes or facilitation payments, theft of vaccines and medical supplies for the subsequent sale on the black market, excluding individuals from mandatory quarantines in return for a respective payment. An example for such lower-level corruption, there is an inferior level of severity with regards to endangering the health of the general public, but still has direct implications on the spread and containment of the virus, is the bribing of healthcare workers and local policies by foreigners in both Uganda and Cameroon in 2021. All these factors contribute to an average of over 7 trillion USD being lost to corruption yearly, fundamentally decreasing the capital available for public health. The increase of corruption is also reflected in the current statistics on corruption in the healthcare sector. A 2021 survey by Transparency International with over 40,000 respondents from all the EU member states has found that 29% of European residents have used personal connections to access medical care since the COVID outbreak in 2020, and more than 6% of respondents have paid bribes to healthcare workers. Three key characteristics are present when it comes to underlying factors of corruption driving stimuli during the current pandemic. An increased competition for scarce resources to a globally apparent industry overarching recession. The accelerated and extensive provision of public funds and the procurement of swiftly needed medical supplies and vaccine. And lastly, the therewith associated significant discretion public servants and healthcare professionals can exploit when implementing said financial resources. This provides fertile ground for various forms of corruption, especially rent-seeking. As already mentioned, one of the greater risks posed by the effects of the pandemic on corruption is that of individuals and suppliers taking advantage of the intransparent government procurement process for ensuring the availability of medical equipment to the respective general public. The procurement process follows set steps: the pre-bidding phase, bidding phase, and the post-bidding phase. Within the phase of pre-bidding, risks are, for example, posed by the potential of consciously overestimating the total demand for specific services or goods, not following the policies of tender processes, or even knowingly falsifying official documents in favor of a particular supplier. After having received the respective bids from supplier, corruption risk during the bidding phase of public procurement comprises the possibility of public servants accepting bribes or facilitation payments to favor a particular supplier, and the post-bidding phase subsequently presents the risk of falsified invoices, previous agreements or insufficient delivery of vaccines and further medical supplies. Even under normal circumstances, the procurement process of public institutions constitutes one of the biggest corruption risks out of all the governmental functions. However, granting contracts after governmental bidding requests during the pandemic significantly deviates from non-pandemic times, as governmental procurement faces a supplier's market based on the fact that an inferior level of leverage can be held over the suppliers due to the shortage of medical goods, and both time and suppliers of a high standards of quality generally being scarce. The risk of corruption along the governmental procurement process is of exceptional severity when it comes to vaccines. As COVID vaccines are highly demanded in extensive amounts on a global scale, this presents an unprecedented level of production and distribution, which constitutes a corruption risk threatening the health of the general public. In the context of vaccine procurement, corruption risk compromise the entire of vaccines of poor quality into distribution, vaccine falsification, theft during the distribution process, misuse of public funds meant to accelerate the vaccine research and production, and favoring of respective producers by public officials in exchange for bribes and facilitation payments. Due to the chaotic nature of crisis, there is risk of neglecting the mitigation of corruption risk. Multiple organizations and experts, however, underline the importance of fighting corruption and call for the adaptation of existing anti-corruption policies to the current context. Countermeasures include, but are not limited to, investments in monitoring and compliance regarding corruption within the healthcare sector and along the governmental procurement process, the development of suitable guidelines for all parties involved, the setup of specific channels to report COVID-related corruption, the establishment of anti-corruption task forces committees, the enhancement of transparency through public info accessibility on who supplies what and how contracts are granted, and lastly, oversight of public bodies and strict investigations when there are suspicions.
Even first world developed countries like Germany are not exempt from corruption. The attempt of government at fighting the global pandemic have opened the floodgates for COVID-19 related corruption by public officials and politicians. The mask scandal in Germany involved several members of the CDU and CSU in the German parliament who received commissions to lobby for mask suppliers at a time when many companies wanted to sell protective masks to the government. Multiple politicians were involved in this scandal. Each of them owns a company through which they were commissioned. Here you have an overview of everyone involved in this scandal to help you understand the case better. The beforehand mentioned politicians lobbied for the following companies: Lomotex, which is a Hessian textile company that sold masks and other equipment for a total of 63 million euros. And on the other side, Emix Trading, a Swiss trading startup that made around 700 million euros thanks to Andrea Tandler. Now let's talk about the chronology. Alfred Sauter contacted the Bavarian Ministry of Health on March 12th in 2020 about the possibility to purchase masks from the Hessian textile company Lomotex. A week later, after several emails exchanged, the Bavarian Ministry of Health ordered masks for around 14 million euros from Lomotex. The same day, Sauter contacted the Bavarian Ministry of Health. Georg Nüßlein, the former vice chair of the CDU and CSU, informed the head of central department at the Federal Ministry of Health about the possibility to purchase masks from the company Lomotex. Nüßlein spammed the former Federal Minister of Health, Jens Spahn, and the head of the department with emails asking them to hurry up as prices are getting higher. Shortly after, he wrote Thomas Limberger, a German businessman, on his official letterhead about the state's interest in buying 21 million masks quickly. On March 27, the German Ministry of Health ordered a total of 8.5 million masks. Then, on March 17, Nüßlein offered again masks using his Bundestag email account, this time to the president of the federal police, resulting in the Ministry of Interior buying 3 million of FFP2 masks. Just after, the three ministries bought masks and other equipment from Lomotex for a total of 63 million euros. Limberger's company Pluto, that is based in the Caribbean, received gradually 10 million euros in commission from Lomotex. The transfer was done through a bank account in Liechtenstein, but further payments were eventually stopped because the bank got suspicious. Pluto then paid the company Pecom, which belongs to Sauter's daughter, a commission of 1.243 million euros commissioned Sauter himself. Lastly, 660,000 euros were paid to Nüßlein's company Tecom. Not only did Alfred Sauter and Georg Nüßlein profit from mask deals, in fact, Andrea Tandler, the daughter of CSU grandee Gerold Tandler, made enormous profits. Around 48.3 million euros were collected from mask deals in total in Bavaria with the federal government. Emix Trading hired Andrea as their intermediary to broker deals with them. Therefore, she contacted Monika Hohlmeier from the CSU to get in contact with Melanie Hummel, the Bavarian Ministry of Health, Jens Spahn, the Federal Minister of Health, and Karl-Josef Laumann, the NRW Health Minister. Emix paid Andrea Tandler's company, Little Penguin, and her partner Darius a total of 48.3 million euros in commissions. They invested the money into stocks, gold bars, and real estate. In total, their company made a profit of 150,000% from this mask deal, as their expenses only were around 320,000 euros in 2020. In the end, Andrea brokered deals for about 700 million euros, but Monika Hohlmeier claimed that she did not receive any money for putting them in contact. Now, after having laid out the chronology of the given case study and both parties and companies involved in the public scandal, let's take a look at the consequences thereof. The CDU-CSU recorded significant losses in voters shortly after the scandals. Political scientist Albrecht von Lucke identified a crisis of confidence as a result of this mask affair, and not only the union fraction. Other parties would hardly be strengthened by it. Rather, he said, there was a damage to the entire political system, in fact, to democracy at all. Alfred Sauter and Georg Nüßlein, among others, were forced to resign from the CDU and CSU after massive pressure. The CDU and CSU parliamentary group asked all of its deputies to make a declaration of honor, confirming that they had not gained any financial benefits from dealing with the state in the corona crisis. This was signed by all deputies. It was criticized that, although no personal enrichment had taken place, party donations did not fall under this. In March 2021, investigations were launched against the defendants Sorter Nüßlein and the entrepreneur Thomas Limberger by the Munich Public Prosecutor's Office on suspicion of bribery and corruption of elected officials. In the process, the suspects' alleged commissions were temporarily confiscated by the investigation judge, and house searches were ordered. The entrepreneur Thomas Limberger was taken into custody. In mid-November, defendants were sentenced. In the present case, the Munich Higher Regional Court found neither bribery nor bribery of elected officials under the Section 108E of the German Criminal Code had been committed, because the defendants had not exercised any political mandates in their mediation activities. The defendants were acquitted accordingly and received their commissions back. The public prosecuting office announced that it would appeal to the verdict. On December 15, in 2021, it became known that the Munich Public Prosecutor's Office had reopened investigations into bribery of mandate holders. The masks were allegedly sold at increased prices in order to pay bribes to public officials. The offers of the company Emix were preferred to the others of other companies despite increased market price. Andrea Tandler and her business partner Darius are said to have received 48 million in commissions through the Greenwald-based company Little Penguin for brokering protective equipment worth of 700 million to various German ministries. In 2022, it became known that, according to a statement of the Federal Prosecutor's Office in Karlsruhe and a decision by the Munich Regional Court, the commissions paid to Alfred Sauter, Georg Nüßlein and Andrea Tandler, which had triggered the mask affair, were presumably legal. Money laundering changes were also imposed on Emix, as the Swiss bank UBS detected potential fraud transactions. Furthermore, commissions to Nüßlein, Sauter, Tandler and her partner were immediately frozen during the investigations. Furthermore, as paragraph 108E came under heavy criticism by the public, other politicians and judges due to the inability of prosecute in this case, and a debate was inflamed as to when and how to adapt it accordingly to make the prosecution of corrupt politic servants easier. Additionally, in June 2021, the Bundestag passed a joint bill by the CDU, CSU, SPD, Greens and Left parties that toughens penalties for bribery, prohibits the acceptance of money and expands the obligation to disclose additional income. The reform increases the penalty in the criminal court for members of parliament who take bribes or person who bribe members of parliament for at least 1 year. This means that in future, bribery of members of parliament will be considered a crime. The law also stipulates that members of parliament must report additional income of 1,000 a month or 3,000 a year to the president of the Bundestag. Overall, it can be said that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought up several cases showing corruption on all levels, starting from the individual itself, over organizations, up to governmental officials. Being in a global healthcare crisis resulting in that this affected the population in a time of weakness and worries, resulting in even more questionable moral boundaries that been overstepped of corruptive parties. Having said that, thank you for your attention. For any references, please check out our report.